Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. Muncie is better known to sociologists as Middletown, USA, the site of several of the most important studies on the attitudes and beliefs of the American people. Think Tank is visiting Middletown to find out what's new and what isn't. The topic before the House, revisiting Middletown, this week on Think Tank. As befits a democratic society, Americans are always trying to figure out what other Americans believe. Since the early 1920s, social scientists have been coming to Muncie, Indiana to pursue that goal. The first to arrive were Robert and Helen Lind. In their best-selling and classic book, Middletown, they said they chose Muncie because it was as representative as possible of contemporary American life, yet compact and homogeneous enough to be manageable in such a total situation study. They also liked Muncie because of its rapid growth, its varied industrial culture, and its location at the population center of America. The Lind's unprecedented study found a religious, capitalistic, family-oriented, patriotic, proud, and hard-working America. Robert Lind returned to Muncie during the Depression of the 1930s to write a sequel, Middletown in Transition. One of our panelists, Bruce Geelhoed, is a professor at Ball State University in Muncie and director of the Center for Middletown Studies. He tracks the record on Middletown from the Linds to now. In the 50 years after the Linds first visited Muncie, Americans experienced a depression, a world war, conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, the baby boom, the baby bust, the tumultuous 60s, the greening of America, a sexual revolution, stagflation, and inflation. The conventional wisdom says these events changed the mind of America. Did they? To find out, another of today's guests, sociologist Theodore Caplow, returned to Muncie with a team from the University of Virginia in the late 1970s. In his book, Middletown Families, Caplow found remarkable continuity despite decades of upheaval. The nuclear family was mostly intact, and religion, hard work, and patriotism flourished. And yet, during the recession of the early 1980s, movie maker Peter Davis visited Muncie and painted a bleak picture.
Listen, I don't want this store to go down the tubes. 5.5 years of my life I put into this thing.
In response to the film, I was invited by public television station WIPB in Muncie to see what all the fuss was about. This is Muncie, Indiana, heartland of America, and perhaps the most studied, most researched city in the world. I found that the bedrock values of Middletown were still prevalent in Muncie, despite a deep recession. Since then, America has won the Cold War and experienced 16 years of virtually uninterrupted growth. Now there's a boom on Wall Street and on Main Street. We headed back to Muncie to see what's up in Middletown. The third of our guests, Alan Wolfe, joins us via satellite from Boston. He is a professor of sociology at Boston University and author of the highly acclaimed book, One Nation After All, his account of middle-class attitudes around America.
Gentlemen, welcome. It is a pleasure to have three distinguished academic sociologists to talk about public opinion in America. Where I come from, our nation's capital, it is political pollsters who normally talk about public opinion, and we hear things like, sometime at the same time, it is the year of the woman, it's the year of the angry white male, it's the summer of love, it's the decade of greed, it's malaise, no, it's morning in America, America's on the right track, America's on the wrong track, it's the me generation, it's Generation X, we're bowling alone, I guess comes actually out of the academic community. And you get the feeling of this enormous volatility. And I guess the basic theme within survey research is continuity versus change. And that's what we want to talk about today. Principally, Ted Caplow, perhaps let's just go around the room and get a brief answer. Ted Caplow, you studied the Linz work in the 1920s, 1930s, and came back here in the early 80s, late 70s. Change or continuity?
Continuity wins hands down. Let me tell you something else about that. I've recently completed a study comparing responses to the General Social Survey in 1994 with 1974. And the continuity is astounding. On particular issues where there's been great public controversy, like abortion and police brutality, you could literally substitute the answers to the questions in 94 for those of 74 and never know the difference.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Bruce, what do you think? Are you a continuity man or a change man?
Well, continuity in regards to Muncie as Middletown, I would agree with Ted, but I'd also say that a lot of the issues and concerns that people show nationwide at the top of their issue list, if you want to call it that way, are reflected in the thinking of people in Muncie, and historically that's been the case. Crime, the condition and the quality of public education, what does the future hold for our children, our grandchildren regarding to employment prospects in the area, in the region. How are we going to pay for higher education for our families?
And these remain as constants?
These remain as constants, certainly over the past generation, yes.
Okay. Alan Wolfe, who is joining us from Boston, who has recently finished a book, has more recent data, One Nation After All. Where do you come out on this?
Well, it probably won't surprise you, Ben, to learn a little of both. I'm impressed by the continuity. I think my colleagues are absolutely right about that. But there's also been on some issues a big change, and we see that, in recent events, the way the American public has changed its views about adultery, for example, and how serious a sin that might be. That represents some kind of change.
Okay.
Let's talk about adultery.
God, I want to thank you all for getting into sex so early, because that really helps us a lot. I mean, that's great. Go ahead.
Now, one of the most amazing things about comparing the survey responses 20 years apart was that the disapproval of extramarital sex was exactly the same, give or take a point or two, and in the wrong direction, in 94 as in 74. Now, attitudes about premarital sex had changed dramatically, but the public's toward more permissive-ness, but not a trace of more permissiveness on adultery.
Well,
now, I think Mr. Wolfe is talking about recent, well-known scandalous developments and the extent to which they may have revealed not, I think, a shift of basic attitudes, but the application of those basic attitudes to a particular case.
Alan?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. We see this over and over and over again. You talk to people about an issue like abortion, for example, and they sound remarkably pro-life. You introduce a qualification and they begin to back down. You introduce another qualification. By the end of the interview, they sound completely pro-choice. I think that's what we need to recognize with surveys, that they just capture an aspect of opinion. They don't capture opinion itself.
Alan, let me ask you if you could first briefly describe what you did in your book. I mean, you sort of, am I right in saying that you created sort of a virtual Middletown?
Well, it's a very good description. I mean, let me first say that I have great respect for the Middletown studies and all the follow-ups that have been done. For me, it's like the Framingham Heart Study. It's an unusually wonderful method for tracking long-term social change, which is, or indeed social continuity, which is one of the things we lack. But I think that if the Linds were alive today, they couldn't do it again. They couldn't make a claim that Muncie, Indiana was representative of anything, and they would be forced much more now than they were then to justify the choice of one particular community. So I wanted to look at different kinds of communities, and I did. I looked at people, I talked to people in San Diego and in the Georgia suburb, Atlanta, Georgia suburbs.
But your panel was all suburban, right?
But they were all suburban and they were all middle class. Yeah, the continuity versus change theme. I mean, something had to be constant, but something also had to change. I mean, my point is simply that we have become much more of a very, very divided society, at least in the sense that no one place can stand for all of what we are. Yet when we look at all these different suburbs, I found a remarkable degree of agreement, which suggests that for all the talk about how divided we are, there are actually some things that are still in common.
If one had to put, let's get really into soundbite land now, if one had to put a single word onto what you found, is the word tolerance the right word?
I prefer to call it non-judgmentalism, because I think tolerance means that you make a judgment that something else is wrong and you still are willing to accept it. Whereas a great deal of what I found was a kind of, you do your thing and I'll do mine, and if you don't intervene in my business, I won't intervene in your business.
Well, but then how do you account for this idea that there is so much in the academic literature and the popular literature and the think tanks about how we're splitting apart and multiculturalism and incivility and everybody yelling at each other? And in my typical hometown of Washington, D.C., people say they want to leave Congress, heaven goodbye, heaven forfend, because they can't get along anymore and everybody's attacking each other. And you go out there and you say, hey, these are pretty nice folks.
Yeah.
Where's the disconnect?
Let's talk about change now instead of continuity.
Okay. Yeah.
Two big changes. First is that the federal government, which used to enjoy universal respect and work rather well in its limited way, no longer enjoys much respect or works very well. Second big change, and this may have something to do with what both Bruce and Alan were saying a moment ago, we are no longer a censorious people, except in theory.
You better define the word.
Practically everyone disapproves of divorce, but practically no one disapproves of their brother's divorce. And we've seen that, of course, writ large in the recent presidential affairs. What people disapprove of in theory, they are very likely to tolerate in the particular case. This didn't used to be true back in the 1920s.
That's why I think, you know, if I can add something, that's why I think, I hate to make an unabashed plug, but we're sociologists. I think our discipline, which is in great disrepute in the country, actually has something really valuable to offer. And that is, you can take some of these cliches that are thrown around about our incivility or whatever, bowling alone, all of them, and actually go out and try to find out whether they're true.
Bowling Alone
I know.
was written by a sociologist.
Well, it was written by a political scientist. Fair enough. Fair enough. But, you know, Ben, you're in Washington. You know how these things get thrown around. That's how you started the program. I was very impressed by one, since I'm studying suburbia, and that was an idea attributed to our former Secretary of Labor, Robert Reich, who talked about gated communities and how these suburban gated communities represent a withdrawal from America. He even named a couple of places. I actually went out and I interviewed people in those places, and you know what? I couldn't even find the gates, let alone the kind of selfish inner, you know, withdrawal. Mr. Reich actually used the word secession when he talked about these communities, which is one of the most emotionally laden terms in American history.
Mr. Reich has a problem with overstatement, which is an understatement. Let
me ask Alan.
You said that, I didn't.
Yes, I know I did. Right.
Ben, you introduced the idea of discord,
Right.
And division, and Alan is talking about the aspects of continuity and the aspects of agreement. I was very struck by an observation that Alan put in his book about these divisive issues in the culture are debates among intellectuals, but they are not necessarily being debated outside of the intellectual or outside of the academic community. And I thought that was an interesting observation, to the extent that these sorts of areas of disagreement where people are polarized do not affect you when you go to the grocery store, do not affect you on the job, do not affect in some respects the way that you raise your children. And I think we can see evidence of this in a small, medium.
Wait a minute. Now, the commercial political pollsters who make their living by identifying the things that split people apart so their candidates can say, I got this wedge issue, I got that wedge issue. I mean, there are lots of wedge issues in America. I mean, Alan mentioned abortion. That's a big one. School busing.
No.
It's not a big one.
No, well, there's a great consensus in the country around abortion, and I think politicians recognize at some level that that's true. I mean, Ben, the Republicans in particular who went for these wedge issues found that they didn't go very far. And now, you know, when Newt Gingrich runs for president, he's going to be running as a centrist because he understands what the pollsters don't seem to get. You know, in my more casual, qualitative conversations with people, I have one question where I said, what gets you angry about America? And I'll never forget one person in Cobb County, Georgia, who said, the polls, that's what gets me angry, because the polls polarize you into agree or disagree. And my opinions, he said, are more complicated than that.
But let's talk about the change again for a minute. Ted and I were talking before the show, and Ted, you said one of the really big changes is the status of women.
Mm-hmm. That is a gigantic change. If we go back to the 1920s here in Middletown, no wife of a white-collar worker, not a single one that they ever found, was employed. The wives of factory workers were frequently employed, but only when their husbands lost their jobs and things got desperate. It was universally regarded as a dreadful catastrophe for a wife to have to go to work, and unthinkable for the mother of small children to go to work.
Let me go back to Ted's comment about women. Certainly the change has been tremendous in terms of women in the workforce, the perception of women relative to their family responsibilities and so forth. Now, what are the factors for this? And let me lead you into what I think one of the major factors is, and that's the tremendous increase in women attending institutions of higher education, obtaining degrees, obtaining advanced educations, and then being able to practice in their professions in a wide variety of areas, wanting to do this, let's say, when they instantly leave school, willing to postpone family, willing to postpone marriage considerations, all of that sort of thing along that line. Certainly the business world in the 1970s and 1980s opened up to females in a way that it hadn't prior to that point. So how do you see that?
Well, back when this was happening, the explanation looked very simple. Wages stagnated in 1972 and stayed stagnant for 20-odd years. But consumer demands didn't stagnate. And so it very quickly became impossible for the average male worker to support a family. It was as simple as that, we thought. But of course, all these other things begin to play in. A different self-conception on the part of women. A continuous decline in the birth rate, which means that there is less to do at home. The extraordinary improvement in household machinery.
TV dinners.
TV dinners, but laundry, good heavens. There was a time when the average Middletown housewife spent 2.25 days every week doing the family laundry. Now it probably takes in the aggregate about 20 minutes.
Well,
depending on how careful
20
she
minutes,
is.
but a lot less than 2.5 days.
But
I thought you could say 2.5 hours, but anyway, it's a lot less.
A lot less.
Out of such things,
or a man might help with the laundry himself.
What did you say, Alan?
Out of such things are remarkable social transformations made.
Absolutely. Well, I've always thought that the biggest instrument of change in America has been air conditioning. Mm-hmm. I mean, it really opened up a third or half of the country to wonderful life during half the year. I mean, it's, I think it was designed to keep meat cool by Mr. Carrier.
That has a bearing, strange as it sounds, on the economy of a town like Muncie in the Midwest in the last quarter century here. What did air conditioning do, along with a lot of other conveniences and economic trends? Well, one thing that it did was it opened up the South and the West to a degree of commercial development that hadn't taken place beforehand, because people could move to those areas and live and work in relative comfort. And you all have read about the power shift, about the economic transformation and the growth of the Sun Belt. And there are several businesses and corporations here in Muncie that since the 1960s have chosen to move to the south and to the west as far as their operations are concerned, their branch operations and so forth. Why did they do that? Well, one of the reasons is because they were following their customers, and their customers were moving in that direction. And as these areas grew, they followed along in that respect.
The most recent of which was the last vestiges of the Ball Corporation.
That's the best example.
And we're at Ball State University, and
Right.
Ball Memorial Hospital is around the corner,
That's right.
and this is still
Right.
sort of Ballville in a lot of ways.
The Ball family moved to Muncie in the 1880s and built a magnificent enterprise in glassmaking, employed tens of thousands of people. But as the post-World War II period went into effect, they started following their customers to the south and to the west, to the extent that by the 80s they had 3,000 or so employees working in metal container and aerospace in Colorado. And now we see in the 1990s that this is a logical place for the corporation to put its headquarters and depart from Muncie after well over a century. But the Sun Belt, the growth of the Sun Belt and the growth of high-tech industries in the south and in the west is certainly a major factor in this period here, and we see it as in the its effect in the lives of people in Midwestern communities throughout this area.
Alan, another change has been in the degree, the magnitude of suburbanization in America. I mean, I was just looking at some data. In 1900, 60% of the people lived in rural surroundings, and now it's about 25%. When I started writing some census books, it was sort of a third suburban city and farm, and now it's over 50% suburban. Is that a good thing, a bad thing? Got a lot of cliches in that one. Oh, it's a mall culture, and it's terrible, and it's sterile, and what do you think?
Well, I believe it or not, I don't think it's my job to say whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's my job to point out, however, that clearly it corresponds to some need that people feel about where they want to live, and that someone who respects democracy probably ought to respect the choices people make about such an important decision for them. By the way, one should also point out that the great growth in suburbanization has been among minority communities, that both Hispanics and African Americans are suburbanizing at rates much higher than whites.
I am declaring that an affirmative answer, notwithstanding the fact that you said you are going to be non-judgmental about it, but that is a pretty affirmative answer.
I think
Let's
you're probably
go
right
one
about
step
that.
further.
You're right about that, right?
Your 25% or so rural, of course, are not rural in the old sense. They're essentially the way out of suburbs, because only 2% of the labor force are left in farming. Here in Delaware County, the number of farms has decreased every recent year, while the size of farms increases. So fewer and fewer people are really engaged with the land. And most of the people living in rural villages and open areas are essentially suburbanites.
Let me just say that for guys who started out talking about continuity, we are talking about a lot of change.
Well, sure.
Absolutely.
So I mean, we are drawing to a close on Alan's satellite time anyway. I mean, why do we have 2.5 continuity people here, and yet we seem to always be talking about change?
Well, nobody denies that there's lots of change, but there isn't as much as exists in the popular imagination.
Alan, I mean, family, if you had to pick an issue, that is rock solid, is that right?
In terms of people's commitments to the idea of family?
Yeah, I guess.
No, I think there's always continuity within change. The surveys show, that we're just as religious a people as we ever were in terms of church attendance and so on, just as committed to the family. But we all know that the way in which people practice their religion has changed. The way in which they practice their family life has changed. And it's one of those things where you can go either way. You can be totally impressed by the fundamental continuity of these very conservative institutions, which I am, or you can also be extremely impressed by the adaptability of Americans as they constantly reinvent their lives to deal with modern realities, which I also am. What I try to say in my book, One Nation After All, is that Americans are both traditionalists and modernists at the same time. They're always struggling with trying to hold on to their nostalgia, but accommodating themselves to the world they see around them. I think those are wonderful traits.
Okay, thank you, Ted Caplow and Bruce Geelhoed here in Muncie, and thank you in Boston, Alan Wolfe, and thank you for Think Tank. I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.